Mephibosheth was a man who had been crippled since childhood, forgotten and despised, growing up as a fugitive. However, after a surprising turn of events in his life, he was received with honor in Israel and had the opportunity to sit at the king's table. This story is well known. Mephibosheth has become a symbol for many as someone who journeyed from poverty to prosperity, humiliation to exaltation, and obscurity to nobility. But Mephibosheth's story doesn't end there. Indeed, there is another part of his story that for some reason people seem reluctant to discuss, preach, or sing about. Perhaps it's because in this other part of the story, Mephibosheth was betrayed, unjustly treated, and once again lost everything. Undoubtedly, Mephibosheth's story is exemplary, but it's not the kind of example people often think of. Watch this video until the end, and you will understand who Mephibosheth was and what really happened to him in the Bible. Mephibosheth was the son of Jonathan and the grandson of Saul. Yes, Mephibosheth was the son of the man who was David's best friend. There's another important piece of information about his family. He was the nephew of another man named Mephibosheth, who was the son of King Saul and his concubine named Rizpah. Alongside his brother Armoni, this Mephibosheth, son of Rizpah, was among the descendants of Saul who were handed over by David to be killed by the Gibeonites. Interestingly, Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, was spared from death on that occasion, precisely because of David's loyalty to Jonathan. The exact meaning of the name Mephibosheth is a subject of debate, as the original spelling of the name is uncertain and could be Merib-Baal or Memphibal. However, most scholars believe that the name Mephibosheth means from the mouth of shame. The story of Mephibosheth was marked by tragedies and frustrations. Mephibosheth was born into a privileged life as a prince of Israel. However, when he was only 5 years old, his life changed completely. His grandfather, King Saul, his father, Jonathan, and his older uncles died in a battle against the Philistines. When Mephibosheth's nurse received the tragic news that the boy's grandfather and father were dead and that the Israelite monarchy had been practically destroyed, she hastily tried to flee with him. The nurse's despair is understandable because according to the customs of the time, when a dynasty was defeated, the new dynasty exterminated the entire royal lineage to prevent any future disputes over the throne. However, when the nurse fled with Mephibosheth, the boy fell from her arms and became crippled in both feet. Subsequently, Mephibosheth was taken to Lo-Debar, a place on the border of Gilead. The city of Lo-Debar, located east of the Jordan River, was likely also known as Debir. The name Lo-Debar indicated a place without pastures, but contrary to what some people think, Lo-Debar does not seem to have been a completely insignificant place. In fact, Lo-Debar was the subject of disputes between Syrians, Israelites, and Assyrians throughout its history. The popular idea that Lo-Debar was a completely unimportant place where nothing existed generally comes from an interpretation of the prophecy of Amos, recorded in the 6th chapter of his book, where the prophet cleverly plays on the name Lo-Debar to convey the message that Israel had rejoiced over the conquest of nothing, over the conquest of something worthless. However, this doesn't mean that Amos regarded Lo-Debar as devoid of value. Rather, he was critiquing the Israelite conquest itself as being inconsequential and doomed to be forgotten. For soon, God would raise a foreign nation to oppress Israel. Indeed, this came to pass, and Lo-Debar was eventually conquered by the Assyrians. In Lo-Debar, a man named Machir, son of Amiel, took care of Mephibosheth. Later on, Mephibosheth also had a son named Micah. The story of Mephibosheth truly gained prominence when David, already established as the king of Israel, remembered his friendship with Jonathan and the covenant they had made about 20 years earlier. He inquired if there was anyone left from the house of Saul for whom he could show kindness in honor of that friendship and covenant. Thus, at this point, David displayed behavior contrary to the practices of the time. Instead of seeking to eliminate a descendant of the former dynasty, he sought to honor him and act with mercy towards this descendant. On that occasion, a man named Ziba, who had been a servant in the house of Saul, informed King David about the existence of Mephibosheth, a crippled young man who had been living as a fugitive in Lo-Debar for at least 15 years. Many interpreters perceive a certain prejudice in Ziba's response to King David, as he seemed to emphasize Mephibosheth's disabled condition, perhaps implying that the young man was unworthy and useless by the standards of the time. Regardless, David disregarded Ziba's opinion and immediately ordered Mephibosheth to be brought from Lo-Debar. David then welcomed Mephibosheth with honor, restored to him the properties that belonged to Saul, and allowed him to dine at the king's table daily. Moreover, David also appointed Ziba as his servant. David's attitude towards Mephibosheth can be seen as a representation of God's grace that reaches out to sinners. God acts with mercy and kindness towards those who are disqualified, towards those who deserve nothing. He rescues those who deserve judgment and death, giving them a new life in his presence. However, Ziba proved to be an unreliable person. During the rebellion of Absalom, when David's son attempted to usurp the throne and forced David to flee from Jerusalem, Ziba revealed himself to be a great traitor and opportunist. The Bible recounts that Ziba went to meet David, bringing provisions and supplies that would undoubtedly be useful during that difficult time. However, Ziba also took advantage of the situation to falsely accuse Mephibosheth. He told King David that Saul's grandson had stayed in the capital because he coveted the kingdom and believed that he would regain his family's throne. It seems that David believed Ziba's lie, as he decided to give him everything that belonged to Mephibosheth. Yes, that's right. All the possessions, properties, and wealth that Mephibosheth had received when he left Lo-Debar were handed over to his treacherous servant. What Ziba did was very serious because in those times, being accused of treason often led to death. Later, when David returned to Jerusalem after Absalom's death, Mephibosheth sought to meet the king to defend himself and prove his innocence. When Mephibosheth appeared before David, the king asked him why he hadn't come to meet him earlier. Then Mephibosheth had the opportunity to recount Ziba's betrayal. He explained that he had asked Ziba to saddle a donkey so that he could travel to meet David, as he was unable to walk due to his disability. However, Ziba left him behind and concocted a plan to accuse him of treason. In fact, during the period when David had to flee from Absalom, Mephibosheth mourned deeply for him, following the customs of the time. This meant that Mephibosheth neither washed his feet nor his clothes, and he refrained from grooming his beard. This was a clear display of loyalty to King David, showing that he did not support Absalom's plan and never coveted the throne. After hearing Mephibosheth's version of the story, it appears that David believed him. However, he proposed that the inherited possessions be divided between Mephibosheth and Ziba. In other words, David did not fully restore everything to Mephibosheth. The Bible does not provide further information about why David made this decision. Some scholars suggest that perhaps the king was not willing to hold Ziba accountable for his betrayal. This may have been due to David's emotionally fragile state at that time. Other interpreters believe that David may have been uncertain about the truthfulness of the explanation given by Jonathan's son. Whatever the reason, the king chose a neutral position as the resolution of that conflict. Surprisingly, Mephibosheth decided to renounce all of his inheritance. He allowed the traitor to keep everything that was rightfully his, showing that his true concern was solely for David's well-being. Although the story of Mephibosheth is often mentioned in sermons and teachings, it is seldom told accurately. Unfortunately, people remember Mephibosheth's story only in the context of prosperity teachings. It is easy to preach about the crippled and despised man who was lifted from obscurity to receive a royal inheritance. It is easy to speak about the man who suddenly gained a privileged position in the court of Israel and was able to sit at the king's table. What seems difficult is to preach about the same crippled man who was betrayed by his servant, and though innocent, had to share his inheritance with the treacherous servant. For many, it is challenging to preach about the example of someone who remained faithful even when unjustly treated, harmed, and when everything went wrong in his life. Even more challenging is to preach about Mephibosheth's selfless attitude. He gave up his material possessions and did not care that his personal enemy took everything that was rightfully his. Indeed, the story of Mephibosheth brings important lessons. However, the focus of this story is not on prosperity, but on the character of a man who, despite tragedies and difficulties, remained faithful to his principles. To him, what truly mattered was not material riches, but the return of the anointed one of the Lord to his throne. Mephibosheth did not set his eyes on earthly things, but on God's sovereign purpose for his people. To him, communion with the king was more important than all of his inheritance. If you enjoyed learning about who Mephibosheth was in the Bible, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and share your thoughts in the comments.